You're listening to the Sustainable Angler Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Crawford. In this episode, I interview the South Carolina Aquarium's Director of Conservation, Albert George, and we talk about everything from climate mitigation and adaptation strategies in the Lowcountry of South Carolina, the Resiliency Initiative for coastal education, the Gullah Geechee people and Southern culture, and how one person can make a difference. Hope you enjoy. This episode of The Sustainable Angler is brought to you by Emerger Strategies, a sustainable business consultancy whose mission is to solve the climate crisis by helping your business go carbon neutral and zero waste. Emerger Strategies has also recently founded the Fly Fishing Climate Alliance, whose members have pledged to go carbon neutral by 2030. To learn more, visit emergerstrategies.com. Well, Albert, I think that the last time that I saw you, we were at the Lowcountry Land Trust event, and that was the first time we actually met. Back in, was that maybe January?
Yeah. It seemed like a long time ago, but yeah.
It seems like that was about 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like we've known each other for a long time.
That's exactly right. And what was cool about that was getting to know a little bit more about you, but also it's always cool to meet someone who is also from the Lowcountry and loves the Lowcountry and makes this conservation and climate connection. So I'm really excited about today and for you taking the time to do an interview. So I appreciate it.
No, Rick, the feeling is mutual, and we love where we live, and we live in a great place. So why not celebrate it? But at the same time, how do we, think about how to mitigate risk, to keep it around. So I'm excited to talk with you.
Cool. Well, Albert, for the folks out there that don't know you, you are the Director of Conservation at the South Carolina Aquarium. That's your current role, but you've been doing climate work and sustainability and conservation work for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I thought I would let you run with that and give us your background and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah. Well, I joke about being really Gullah Geechee for real. As the line of demarcation for most people, the Savannah River.
Yeah.
And and I joke about my mom, whom I love and adore. My mom's side of the family is from South Carolina, and had the pleasure of having deep family roots here. But when my mom passed away when I was young, my grandmother raised me in Savannah. So I said I've lived on both sides of the Savannah River. Now I'm back north of the Savannah River, and I've lived to tell the story. So the first thing first, as you mentioned earlier, I am a real homie. I am from the Lowcountry, and I've had the honor of living, in different parts of the Lowcountry throughout my sort of upbringing. In terms of my background, I joke about the fact that I'm a card-carrying marine biologist. My career, started in marine biology when I started studying marine biology at Savannah State University. And pretty much from there, from the mid-1990s, I've been working in the mud or I've been working in the lab, through the years. But then right around, I would say 2001, became really engaged around the topic of climate change and potential implications for our region. And from that time up until now, I've been working in various capacities to do. First, I was involved with what we call mitigation, which is, looking at how do we reduce the amount of greenhouse gases getting into the atmosphere. now, just given the current state of affairs, with that mitigation that goes sort of swiftly as we would like for most of us who've been in the game for a while, now we're at a point where we have to sort of think about adaptation, not sort of putting mitigation aside, but because of we're locked into some pretty dynamic changes of roughly at least 6 feet of sea level rise potentially over the next 85 years, I think we have to put, adaptation at the top of the list as well right now.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so a couple of things. We talked about this, just for the folks out there listening to, I'm from Savannah. So Albert and I are have that in common. And now I'm in his neck of the woods up in Charleston. So, but I do basically with my business, Albert, I focus a lot on the mitigation side of things. Mm-hmm. In terms of reduction strategies and how can we get to carbon neutral and zero waste and things such as that. But the adaptation side is really interesting. And that has a lot also to do, I think, with resiliency, right?
Correct. And the thing I would say, and Rick, I want to make this point expressly, we at the end of the day, we have to solve the equation of mitigation, right? I mean, for us to really bring things back to the levels of having things stabilized over the longer term, and I'm speaking in geologic term at this point, right? That we have to figure out how we're going to live in balance and reduce the amount of anthropogenic greenhouse gases, right? And what I told people, so what I just want to emphasize is that by no means am I saying that we need to lose focus on that. The only thing that I think that I've been just pragmatic and just a realist about, just given where we locked into right now. And as you know, we see those effects right now here in Charleston, that we have seen a dramatic increase of what we call sunny day flooding events that went from roughly about 2-ish sort of events in the 1970s to now, we have broken records, 3 years in a row where, last year we were over 50 days of flooding without rain. And so when you start looking at that type of data, then when you look at the latest NOAA data that states that, if things persist along this current, glide trajectory, that here in a place like Charleston, that by 2045, you can have 180 days of flooding without rain. And so, again, I want to emphasize mitigation. We have to stay focused on that. But unfortunately, because of just the realities that I laid out in sort of broad strokes, we have to be focused on adaptation. And as you mentioned, a big part of adaptation is a focus on resiliency and how, in the face of these changes, we can make the needed sort of strategic moves or sort of the strategic priorities to mitigate these risks where we don't see as much dramatic, or the impact is not as dramatic as it could be, as I put it in those terms.
Yeah. And so can you dive in a little bit deeper? Like what are some adaptation, I guess, strategies or things like that can help us, I guess, to be able to be resilient to climate change here in Charleston?
Yeah, well, one of the things, I believe in starting home first, like literally let's start where we live. And one of the things we're blessed with, Rick, in this part of the world is what we call green infrastructure. We're blessed with the salt marshes. We're blessed with the maritime live oak forest. We're blessed even with the fresh water interplays between the brackish water, fresh water. The Lowcountry is abounding in what we call green infrastructure. But as you know, and I know, that there is downward pressure on that infrastructure. And the sad thing about it is that, what I tell people, for us, if we could just protect what we have, if we do a better job at protecting the salt marsh, a better job at protecting the salt marsh, the maritime live oak forest, the greenways that we possess, that would actually, bode well for us being resilient over the longer term. So that's the first thing. I just wanted to put that out there as first. The second thing I would say that it may sound simple, but is to the point, is the lack of awareness around these issues. I think that unfortunately, For whatever reason, there's still a big power curve of a big gap between the people who are in the know and not in the know that these changes are occurring. And so a big push of what we've been trying to do, through the Resiliency Initiative for Coastal Education, which spells R.I.C.E, a big part of our push has been how do we just make people aware that, that water that kind of been getting in your backyard that you didn't used to see is part of a bigger phenomenon that you need to be aware of. So I would say the second part of it is, is definitely just raising that awareness. And then I think the third part, even though I kind of alluded to it, when I first started mentioning about protecting sort of the great, rich resources that we have, the third part is basically us being mindful that, the type of land zoning and building codes and all of those things that we sort of don't necessarily, all the time marry up with sort of green infrastructure, protecting sort of the greenways. We have to do that. It's not like a good thing to do anymore. Just where we are, just in this sort of current time in history and the escalation principles, we can't just sort of haphazardly develop a land use, a zoning, or other related practices that's not in alignment with sort of greening, protecting our sustainable resources.
Yeah. So a few things that I'll circle back around on. For green infrastructure, like if just to make sure that I'm also clear on it, what you're talking about essentially is the natural ecosystem services that, say, our marshes provide, and like absorbing carbon, for example, or our maritime forest. I'm sure they do the same thing, right? They're all absorbing carbon. So by not developing them and keeping them intact, we are that in and of itself is helping to solve climate change.
You better believe it. I mean, because you think about it like this, and you think about green infrastructure. So definitely carbon sequestration. I've seen data, Rick, where sort of estuarine habitats in some instances has a higher ratio of carbon sequestration than forest, right? In terms of when you think about their ability to, when you think about aggregation within their soil or pluff mud, in addition to the vegetation. So that definitely spot on there. But what I would also add, in addition to the carbon sequestration, is the natural flood mitigation that these ecosystems form, right? In terms of being able to have some place where the excess water runoff could go to. And so let's use a specific example. When I think about R.I.C.E that occurred about, a little over 5 years ago, that basically when you think about, we had like 26 inches of rain in Mount Pleasant over 24 hours, 24 inches in Charleston. I think Columbia really only had about maybe like 16 inches. But you kind of remember Columbia was flooded to Hades and back, right? And you think about what's the difference between Columbia versus Charleston versus Mount Pleasant? The biggest difference is what? Green infrastructure, right? I mean, the water had some place to go, and we had it was able to balance out against all of the impervious substrate that comes along with cities. So I would put in flood risk mitigation, and then not even to mention when you think about the salt marshes and maritime live oak forests, you're talking about one of the most productive ecosystems in the world in terms of nature ways and serving as the nursery of the fisheries of the Atlantic Ocean and things of that nature. So correct on all of those fronts.
That's a interesting point that I got my mind wrapped around carbon sequestration, and I didn't even think about the value that it brings just from flood mitigation, and also I guess with hurricanes, things like our barrier islands protecting us and oysters, and helping to reduce that energy before it actually hits the coast where more people live.
Yeah, it's invaluable, and we have been beneficiaries of those ecosystem services, and and I almost look at them as like guardian angels. They're kind of doing this great job that no one kind of knows about or fully appreciates, but they literally are providing life-saving and life nurturing services on so many different levels. For us not to be thinking about how we can protect them and cultivate their sort of viability over the longer term is unthinkable, to be honest with you.
Yeah. So, so Albert, tell me more about R.I.C.E. Rice. What's that initiative all about?
Yeah, well, when I took on this role, actually June 1st of this year was my 5-year anniversary at the South Carolina Aquarium. I have the honor of serving as the first director of conservation. And so when I took on this role, I wanted to really think about what could be an umbrella initiative that could really speak to where we are as the Lowcountry, where we need to go as the Lowcountry. And, one day when I was actually walking on the Gaston's Wharf was this idea that it came to me. I said, what is the one thing that the Lowcountry is known for? So when I started thinking about it, number one, we're known for being the corridor for the salt marshes, right? When you think about from Georgetown to Savannah, you think about salt marsh. But then the other thing that comes to my mind is from Georgetown to Savannah, that's the old Rice Kingdom, right? That's the place between Georgetown and Savannah, Georgia. And of course it went down further south, but I'm talking about the epicenter of the Rice Kingdom was, to me, from Georgetown to Savannah. And when you think about that, what is at the heart of rice production? Large-scale waterland engineering, right? That when you think about sort of what is at the heart of rice production is large-scale waterland engineering. But then when you think about what is at the crux of resiliency, right, as it relates to us in the Lowcountry, and it's large-scale waterland engineering, right? And so one of the key things that the Resiliency Initiative for Coastal Education, which spells RICE, is that it's a purposeful homage to our past. And what I'm just trying to tell people, or what I'm just trying to remind people of, Rick, is that we have over 300 years of history of doing large-scale waterland engineering in this part of the world, right? Mm-hmm. And the key thing that I was excited about with the RICE Initiative is that how do we, pay homage to our history, but also recognize the fact that we have within our historical frame of reference the type of skill set we need to mitigate the current dynamics or the current risk coming our way with the rise in sea levels, right? And so the whole intent of the Resilience Initiative Coastal Education is to remind us of our past in the great history in this region around large-scale waterland engineering, but also is to challenge us to say that just because we're challenged with this sort of potential threat that we have within our DNA, the makings to leverage our sort of knowledge of large-scale waterland engineering to mitigate these risks that comes along with the climate change and sea level rise if we just open up our minds and our hearts to tackling this issue.
Yeah, and so with rice cultivation and sort of this engineering that you're talking about as I guess an adaptation and mitigation strategy, how could we basically how would that work in terms of helping us to learn from the past to be able to adapt to our rising sea levels?
Yeah, well, the only thing I would say, and you're probably familiar with this as well, is that, we had the Dutch dialogues that came to Charleston. And that was a year-long discussion with the Dutch. But think about it. When you boil that discussion down that we had with the Dutch, it was all about how do we live with water, right? How do we integrate water management across the entire watershed? And how do we leverage green infrastructure and different ways we can leverage green infrastructure, water, land use practices to be more adaptive to live with water? Yep. And one of the things that I value that, and I think it's great for us to be able to collaborate with international bodies and leaders of thinking about this. But the only thing I would say, just as a proud person from the Lowcountry, is that sort of know-how and knowledge is already here, right? In a lot of ways, we still use a lot of those rice plantations for other things other than just sort of rice production. A lot of, when you think about the Ace Basin, in particular, when you think about the where the SCDNR Ace Basin location is located, they're using the same rice trunk system, rice trunks and rice plantation infrastructure to have different flood levels within the different sort of rice areas or rice ponds and varying those levels to attract different type of waterfowl, a different type of birds that would come in. We have a world-class birding destination, a world-class birding corridor in our region. And so similarly, when you think about, let's just think about how a rice plantation works, that basically they're using canals and they're using the precursor to the dam system, which is the rice trunk, to control the flow of water, two-way flow of water. And the key thing there is that this is all surface water management, right? That this is, managing water on the surface of a terrestrial plane, right? Mm-hmm. And if you think about what the Dutch specifically have been known for, they have been known for managing water, in the surface terrestrial plane, living with water inside of their urban design, right? And so in many ways, what I'm sort of, saying within our current sort of thought framework around rice is that the same way we were able to sort of do terrestrial water management through the system of sort of canals and sort of, the rice trunks and sort of having areas where you can have increased area for water storage and for water release. In a lot of ways, those are the similar type of strategies that the Dutch recommended, correct? They were telling us that we could benefit from surface drainage capacity, right? The ability to hold water in a surface drainage related sort of configuration or structure or system. And then that would aid that our sort of current sort of infrastructure around sewage and drainage, that would aid where it won't sort of overflow our current infrastructure and the sewage and the drainage, because at a certain point, you don't have a gradient for anything to flow out of, right? And a lot of times we reverse flow. So it's really just that same principle. How do you create enhanced surface drainage and storage capacity that then allow you to sort of proactively manage the flows of water? And in this case, instead of manage it for rice production, I would say that we have an opportunity to manage it as it relates to flood risk reduction.
Wow. That is pretty incredible and amazing. And I was, I'm just kind of blown away that is, that's just amazing that strategy could be used. And it's something that I never would have thought of in a million years.
Well, I want you to know, my brother, it's part of your DNA, man. As you as a low country homie, you this is part of our culture, man.
I hear you.
We've been doing it for a while, but I think people kind of forget about that, and you forget about we've done it at a large scale. I mean, you talk about, I've heard some estimates that said that basically the amount of land that was removed or modified to build our rice plantation system was more land moved than stones that were used to build the great pyramids of Egypt. And so you talk about, we don't get a lot of hype and a lot of credit for the amount of engineering or the great engineering that was done as a part of the rice plantation structure. But you're talking about one of the biggest engineering projects in the history of humankind, when you think about the scale and the amount of land that was modified.
That's unreal. It really is. And I mean, I'm loving this because I'm learning so much from you on this call. And this is just, it's fascinating. I mean, more than the Great Pyramids, I mean, that's no small feat. And if you've ever been to the Lowcountry, it's especially not a small feat if you're having to do it in pluff mud and mosquitoes and gnats and everything else. That's incredible.
And I think the only reason why I raise that is sometimes when people think about the current challenges we face, a lot of people can easily get overwhelmed and they could get, to the point where what can we do? Only thing I'm trying to do is to remind them, as a great part of our cultural heritage and history, we've already kind of done this type of stuff before. And we did it with less technology and with less sort of acumen that we have today. And so I just try to remind people that we have that as a part of our culture, that if we just remember that and leverage those lessons learned, that was the whole impetus behind the Dutch dialogues. But I want to say, so many cases when I was listening to the Dutch, I'm like, we've been doing that for over 300 years. in this part of the world, and we have a rich history in doing what you just described.
Yeah, and that's cool, and it's empowering to know that,
Yeah, we've done it before. So Rick, why can't we do it again?
Well, hey, guess what? One way or the other, we're going to be doing it.
Yeah, man, one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Well, and so, and tell me about this, because you brought up earlier, which is one of the things I wanted to talk about too. But being mindful about, building codes and how that affects some of this green infrastructure. And one of the things I saw a documentary that you were part of Waiting for Hope.
Yeah.
And is this and gentrification and how that is affecting the Gullah Geechee communities of the Lowcountry. And so what I would say is, first, there's probably going to be a lot of people that have no idea what Gullah Geechee is. So I'd say, can you provide some background there? And then secondly, how does that, as Charleston grows, like many areas of the country, grows and develops, can you just elaborate on what you mean by being mindful about these building codes and how that affects residents?
Yeah, and the land use and the zoning and things of that nature. But first on Gullah, Gullah Geechee, to all your listeners, that's just shorthand. When you say someone is Gullah Geechee, these are the present day ancestors of the West Africans who came to the United States to, in our case and in our part of the world, to first support the rice plantation, and then the indigo, and then the cotton related agricultural regimes. And so when we say Gullah Geechee, it's those people who are the descendants of the West Africans, which the Gaston's Wharf, where the aquarium is located, it's estimated that 40 to 50% of those people who came from West Africa came right through Gaston's Wharf. So very prominent part of all basically 40 50% of all West Africans who came to the United States came through the Gaston's Wharf in terms of estimates. So, and as we discussed earlier, a big part of this region's identity was the Rice Kingdom, which, ran from Georgetown to Savannah, sort of very prominently. But as, if you're a fan of history, Charleston was known as sort of one of the richest colonies in the world, serving as the epicenter for the exportation of this product and as the commerce center. So again, Gullah Geechee is shorthand for those West African slave descendants who still live in sort of the barrier islands and the coastal watershed areas. And for those who are interested, that the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor is a federally sort of recognized corridor that runs basically from Wilmington, North Carolina, all the way down to Jacksonville, and it runs from the coast roughly to about 30 miles inland. So again, that gives you sort of from a geography perspective, but also from a cultural perspective, like I said, the West African slave descendants who live in that geographic area are considered the Gullah Geechee people. And in terms of when you think about issues around zoning, land use, building codes, and how you would frame that within the Gullah Geechee sort of people's reality, for those who may not be aware, you still have some prominent Gullah Geechee communities like in St. Helena, Mitchellville, 10 Mile, Phillips community, and even Princeville, even further up into North Carolina. You have certain footholds of Gullah Geechee, Sapelo Island down in Georgia. And, what I tell people, Rick, all the time is that because a lot of these people who live in these communities still live off the land, they're still farming, they're still fishing, that these are some of the most low density areas that you have in terms of ratio of built structure versus natural balance, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of my points of advocacy that I've been communicating to people is that when you think about something like salt marshes that are shown scientifically that they can migrate upland, that as the water rises, they can migrate upland. But the key part of them being able to migrate upland, Rick, is having the cleared path or having the land with no obstruction, able to sort of make that general or that gentle sort of migration uphill. And the problem is when you have overdevelopment or development right on the marsh or right behind the marsh, or a street or a highway that runs, that would impede that progress, inevitably you're going to be dooming that particular green infrastructure to not be able to adapt if it has barriers between it and its ability to migrate upland. And so what I tell people a lot of time is that, as ridiculous as it may sound, but if you protect those people who are protecting the land, right, who are literally, still living off the land and who are living in low density in relation to the land, that these are going to be the critical thoroughfares and sort of causeways for nature to be able to adapt to these changes that's coming at it. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of zoning, related practices, how we zone land, how we even, the sad thing is we're not really thinking about how salt marshes, which are going to be critical to the future of a lot of things. I don't think we have even in our bailiwick how we even zone to make sure they have the ability to migrate upland. And then when you factor in, building codes and all these other things, for people to still be able to build in certain areas, regardless of the fact that you have flood risk already associated with those areas, why would you want to zone that land and allow people to build on that land when it's a critical area that shouldn't be built in, number one, because of flood-related risk considerations, but number two, is an area that's going to be critical for the transition of nature. So those are sort of the things that sort of encapsulated when, I think about Gullah Geechee and their ties to the land and them being sort of the caretakers of the land and creating that space for nature to make adaptations as these changes take shape.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, and that's a super interesting point to think about in terms of, the Gullah Geechee communities that are intact today are living this, compared to a lot of other communities or high density areas, a very, like you said, a low impact and low density lifestyle, really, that as a result of that is being connected so closely with the land and still, living off of the land, that they're also able to, what will be corridors for nature to do its thing, in terms of, like you said, like with marshes retreating. And that's just something that, again, I'm I'm loving this conversation, because these are just things that it's mind blowing to me that makes all the sense in the world, but I never thought about it.
No. I mean, that's the downside of I call myself the crazy green guy. I spend too much time probably thinking about these things, Rick. but I give you, but let's drill down a little further, and I give you even, like, one of the things that the South Carolina Aquarium is known for, we're known for our sea turtle care hospital, right? Mm-hmm. And we're known for our work in terms of sea turtle conservation. But when you think about right now, what's the largest per capita area when you talk about sea turtle nested in South Carolina, and even on the eastern seaboard, east, north of Cape Canaveral, Cape Remain Refuge, and in particular, Lighthouse Island and that sort of, area is the largest per capita sea turtle nesting area outside of Cape Canaveral. But it's number one definitely in South Carolina, but I'm talking about a critically important sea turtle nesting habitat in the Cape Remain Refuge area. But the reality is, Rick, that's a prime example of a potential casualty of this thing called sea level rise. I mean, they're already experiencing incredible erosion principles. They already experience a lot of erosion and a lot of concern that, the current constitution of the Cape Remain Refuge, specifically where the sea turtles are nesting, is under siege, and is concerned that how long can it hold, considering the dynamics we just discussed. But one of the areas that people don't know and may not even be on people's radar, that is the second per capita nesting area in the great state of South Carolina is Hilton Head, right? That people may not even know, because guess what? Most, I mean, you and I know that Hilton Head is not known for being a conservation haven. It's known for being a resort area, right?
Right.
And when you think about the last area on Hilton Head Island that is low density or lower density, because that's changing as we speak, it's one of the last Gullah Geechee communities in Mitchellville. And the reality is, if Cape Remain Refuge, let's say theoretically, if Cape Remain Refuge ceased to exist in its current constitution due to sea level rise and other downward erosion principles, that the reality would be, whether Hilton Head Island know it or not, they would become the top most important ecological habitat for sea turtle nesting in the state of South Carolina. Now, the sad truth of it is, because it's not known as being an ecological hub, are people on that island thinking about, as you think about future plans, how do you make room for both humans and nature to coexist? And the sad truth of it is, the last remaining bastion of area that could be high potential for that sort of those coexisting principles is in the Mitchellville area, which is a historic Gullah Geechee community. But unfortunately, as we speak, is being decimated by development. It's being encroached upon by a lot of people who want to develop this area, and in a lot of ways displacing the people who have lived there the longest. So this is, to me, is, you can have the green infrastructure example, but this is also an example of critical habitat for endangered sea turtles that are going to be at stake if we don't protect those people and we don't protect those nature ways that these people kind of serve as the caretakers of.
Well, and I think I agree 110% with you, and it also kind of makes me think about, in terms of preserving cultures, and it makes me think that, if you don't put some level of boundary on some of this stuff, you're going to be in a situation where you've lost the culture, and you don't know whether you're standing in a shopping mall parking lot in Alaska or South Carolina, because everything's going to look the exact same, and everything's going to have the same exact problems. And I know that's a little bit of a stretch from what we're talking about, but it's just one of the things that I always think about as I watch. And I'm not anti-development, but you do have to protect areas and cultures and people and wildlife so that they have the opportunity to thrive, and not doing that is doing a disservice to everyone.
Yeah, and not to get on my my Southern sensibility sort of soapbox, but the thing I take pride about our Southern culture is that we respect and we love all components of our culture, and it's not respective of how much money a person has or don't have. It's really predicated on, we embrace what is here, what has been here, and I totally agree with you, Rick, that my concern is what makes us special, what makes us different, is why a lot of people want to move here, why a lot of people want to sort of come here. But if we don't protect and preserve those elements that make us who we are, and that sort of serve as sort of our sort of positioning in the world as an important place for a lot of different reasons, you're right. I think we not only run the risk of losing terrestrial, related land, but God forbid, if we lose our cultural heritage and identity, what really will stick out, or what can we sort of pass on to future generations if we allow that to occur?
Yeah. I could not agree more. Well, Albert, let's shift gears just for a second, because I want to, because I think this is all interconnected. But at the South Carolina Aquarium, can you talk a little bit more about some of your conservation initiatives and how they relate to some of these issues that we're talking about, whether it be climate change, adaptation, all the things that we're talking about?
Yeah, well, the key thing about, as I mentioned before, about the Resilience Initiative for Coastal Education, or RICE, is really how do we engage all people, not just the elite scientific and policy people, not just the city planners, but all people, rural, urban, in this discourse around how do we sort of understand what does this mean for us? Not just from the 30,000 foot level, but I'm talking about what does it mean for my community? What does it mean for my family? How do we put this in those type of terms?
Mm-hmm.
And and the key thing that we wanted to do, Rick, is to take this conversation out of the ether and bring it down to the community level and bring it down to the individual level. Because at the end of the day, that's where it needs to be. That's how you're going to really be able to inform decision making, where people are going to hopefully make the right decisions to keep themselves and their family and their community safe. And so the front end piece of this has been built around education and outreach. We've had some great partners that we partner with in terms of being able to do the outreach to communities, including the Medical University of South Carolina Public Information Community Outreach, including South Carolina Education TV, Allen University. But we've also, in addition to the outreach component, one of the key things that I've been an advocate for is that we all in this together, meaning that, gone are the days, Rick, where one person can collect enough data where you can have all the data that you need to sort of get at the multiplicity of factors affecting this corridor. And so one of the things we did as an extension of just the community education outreach, we also developed a suite of tools that would allow the everyday citizen first to understand what would 6 feet or 7 feet or 8 feet of sea level rise mean for them and their community. And so we created a sea rise viewer, and that work was actually done in collaboration with Rock Technologies. But in addition to educating them about what would 6 feet of sea level rise or 6 feet of storm surge would look like, we also wanted to be able to partner with these communities, because guess what? These people who live there every day are best positioned to actually understand those changes that's impacted these communities at a very hyper local level. And so in addition to creating the Sea Level Rise Viewer, we also created the Sea Rise Citizen Science Project, which allows everyday citizens to capture and to chronicle and to be able to provide those sort of fundamental inputs that can inform science decision making, policy decision making. And just one quick example I'll give of this is that in the West Ashley, Maryville community, that community, specifically Mr. John Carr, was noticing a huge marsh die-off in that community. And as a result of just being able to engage him and him taking these observations, we've been able to engage some of the best salt marsh, benthic, and sort of plant-based scientists in the country, to, as well as with South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, to come up with a risk mitigation strategy around how do we mitigate this risk of this die-off, this large-scale die-off going on. So basically, we've been trying to educate, inform, but also we've been trying to empower these communities through a suite of tools that would allow them to be a part of the identification of issues, but also how do we, once we identify the issues, how do we come up with sort of solutions to mitigate these issues?
Well, I love that, and I love that when you get the community involved like you're doing, that's when you have the opportunities to actually learn from someone who knows the land, right?
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's what happened with Mr. Carr, and someone going, when I don't know what the story was, but it would be like me growing up in Savannah. There's certain areas that I know like the back of my hand, and I can tell you where things have changed.
You better believe it. And just to get a little deep in that story, and it's a beautiful story, because basically, I basically went out to the community, and this is just for those of you who listen in the radio land. This area is the same area that is home to Charlestown Landing, which is the founding place of Charleston, right? So this is the same area of marsh that is home to Charlestown Landing, is home to what used to be called Maryville, which was the first African-American township of South Carolina. So this is in my book a Stradivarian, salt marsh. If this salt marsh could talk, right?
Right.
Stories, this salt marsh literally is there at the founding of the city of Charleston, right? At Charlestown Landing. But the heartwarming piece of that story, Rick, is when I went out there and I saw the die-off, and I said, well, Mr. Carr, do you have a picture of the marsh when the marsh was healthy? And he said, as a matter of fact, I do. I have a picture of my father on his 80th birthday, swinging in the swing, looking out with that same point of view. And it was actually from him sharing that picture with me, Rick, of his father on his 80th birthday, swinging in the swing, that I had a picture of the last time this marsh was healthy, at its full extent, and basically putting the picture of that 20-year ago photo with the current day sort of degradation pluff mud photo. I sent this information to Dr. James T. Morris, who's arguably one of the top sort of salt marsh ecologists in the world, expecting it maybe a month or two before I hear back from him. I sent these two juxtapositions to him, and within 9 minutes he responded, and the next week he was here on the ground with his waders on, because once he saw the difference, he said he had to come see it for himself.
You're kidding. That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's a great story. And so all right. So this, remind me of the doctor's name again, or the scientist?
Yeah, Dr. James T. Morris. He's based out of Columbia. He's at the Baruch Institute there, but he is a distinguished professor, and he's one of the top salt marsh ecologists in the world. And so I literally sent him a picture of the current present day picture that we uploaded into our R.I.C.E Citizen Science project, along with the picture from 20 years ago with Mr. John Carr's father in the swing. And the difference was so stark until he responded in 9 minutes. And that following week, he was down here with his PhD student taking site-specific LiDAR analysis.
That's unreal. That's incredible. That's awesome. Love it. So what is what happens with that? So is there like, I don't know. What do they do with that information? How do they replenish the marsh?
Well, Rick, this is a great story and a great win, and this is one of those stories that I get a lot of energy from. So I apologize for the people in radio world for me being so energetic. But
don't ever apologize for that.
Yeah,
I love it.
But the long story short is that once Dr. James T. Morris came down and provided the site-specific LiDAR data, that data was then shared with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and in particular, Michael Hodges from the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, who run their SCORE program, which is their oyster reef and salt marsh restoration initiative. As a result of sharing that LiDAR data, Michael Hodges came out, wanted to come for a site visit as well. After his site visit, we deduced a strategy to plant some different strands of marshes that may be more adaptive to the current conditions, that could thrive more with the shifting landscape that's currently occurring in that area. So 2 years ago, we planted those strands, and we were able to codify that data, capture that data, follow that data for a year to see which of those strands would be most sort of acceptable or most sort of adaptive to the current conditions. While that was going on, SCDNR asked us to support a grant that they were submitting for a large scale restoration initiative, and they wanted to include that site as a part of that SCDNR proposal for restoration funding. We actually SCDNR received that funding, and as a result, we're going to be able to plant in partnership with South Carolina Department of Natural Resources and the SCORE program. We're going to be able to plant over 1/2 acre of salt marsh in that community. And
wow.
So the cool thing that I tell people and the exciting thing that I get excited about is, you may say, well, what's the power, because let's bring it full circle, because, I was saying how people feel powerless and some people don't feel like there's nothing they can do. But think about it, by Mr. John Carr taking one photograph or sort of raising the flag or the red flag that something was going on that needed to be someone needed to pay attention to it. As a result of that, not only did he get top scientists involved who want to now do the research and analysis to understand what's going on at a deeper level, we also have been able to mobilize resources to proactively mitigate this die-off situation. And as we discussed earlier, green infrastructure is absolutely critical for flood risk mitigation. So the ability for one person to make a difference, I just want to posit this with all of your listeners to say, if you ever doubt that one person can make a difference, this is, to me, a great example of one person making a difference that's going to impact this community in his lifetime and beyond his lifetime. I think people need hope, Rick,
Yeah.
And one of the things I try to do, I've been trying to do, is to model what I call to demonstrate and to model the type of behaviors that's needed that can get at the things we need to do at a larger scale, And I think, one of the things I've been an advocate for is before, we can sort of ask people to buy into something, you got to give them something to buy into. You got to give them something that they can sort of rally around. And so it's just my hope that in our humble way, that if we can provide these like small wins or examples of wins, that we can get more people in the game and we can work in a collaborative fashion across the entire landscape of the Lowcountry to do this over and over again. So I agree, Rick. I think that's a great place to end it and have people know that, you can make a difference, just by making an observation, you can make a difference.
Thanks for tuning in to The Sustainable Angler, and special thanks to Albert George for joining me today on the podcast. If you'd like to find more episodes of The Sustainable Angler, they can be found anywhere you listen to your podcast, whether that's iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud. And if you like what you're hearing, it'd be great if you could give us a like or leave a rating and review. Thanks.